I'm going to address the current state of our democracy as it functions in landscapes secretly. You see, there's a spooky spectrum of extra-legal and sub-legal spaces emerging through empire and its desperate trajectory to sustain itself that most of us never hear about, much less critically investigate, as well as a counter-spectrum of other sub-architectures that are cropping up to challenge globalization in areas where its legitimacy is seen as offensive or eroding on its own. So lurking just beyond the fringes of public scrutiny, various spatial deposits of political contest are quietly enshrining new zones of exceptional violence and containers of abusive power into built form, attacking the foundations of what it means for space to be humane, ethical, transparent, and just. Deployed like architectural bits of dark matter, the covert sites that correspond with the war on terror are severely hollowing the core of the human project and any participatory system we have or still aim to achieve. There, in this niche of spatial fallout where humanity's legal borders are already vulnerable, a dispersed base of operations has taken shape to execute both formal and informal tactical secrecy, be it in the form of the ingenious smuggler infrastructure and narco-urbanism of the drug cartels, the Taliban's knowledge of its geographical terrain, or the more normalized encoding of indefinite detention within our own domestic framework, or even more so perhaps at the scale of the labyrinthine bureaucracy that shrouds what the intelligence community likes to call the black world. It is this landscape that worries me the most right now, and how these networks of secrecy are infiltrating more and more deeply into our civil affairs. Puppeting space from the shadows of architecture, urbanism, and infrastructure as we know it, we can call this cancerous leviathan of clandestine space dark infrastructure, the underpinnings of what my friend Trevor Paglen calls the imperial production of nowhere. That is, spaces of state power that not only are produced to avoid detection and public oversight, but to technically not even exist at all by virtue of their absence of any official recognition. The most popular example is probably Area 51 in the Nevada wasteland, a massive conspiracy-bugged military installation the US government still denies even exists to this day. Though the global footprint of secret space is obviously far more vast than this example, and certainly defies any precise geospatial measure, it hardly seems anywhere today that any place has developed an immunity to the urban geoeconomic tentacles of the military-industrial complex and the more discrete back-end spaces that ensure its cogs keep churning. Let's face it, the Pentagon has found a way to tool, tap, invade, filter, hack, fortify, and oversee just about every sphere of our daily reality. And in my view, this military urbanism is the condition of globalization. But to the degree that state-concealed war crimes and other crimes against humanity are being committed in the name of freedom is a dark, elaborate space of deception most of us generally turn away from. So my first question is, as urbanists, how are we going to wrestle with this landscape? Is it possible through spatial practice to help detect these architectural cavities of our government's own legacy of human and civil rights misconduct? How do we begin to negotiate for a fair politics of space in this arena? For as much as we can build in a better way towards a more equitable society, how can we leverage our skills and positions as spatial mediators to begin an excavation of this type of organizational power and to recalibrate the moral calculus of our political structure? Connecting the urban centers of the world with their vast ex-urban peripheries, we might imagine a series of concentric rings or radiuses of secrecy that pervades the political atmosphere from a megalomaniacal core, and within these rings, separate infrastructures that help align and enable various covert activities to take place along their own continuum. Sure, we can talk about the future, but the present day is already the gross national product of a landscape precariously whittled away by the ruins and politics of secrecy. If we've created a truly borderless and liberated world for anything these days, you could argue the biggest beneficiaries are political corruption, military superpower, state secrecy, and the vaulted indexes of multinational corporate power. But the kind of power a truly just society is up against today requires space and circuitry to hide and expand its viral corruption. So when I think about the defense industry wielding limitless power in the production of space, nothing in my book could be more threatening to our political constitution or the tenets of our built environment than this insidious sanctuary this tyrannical superpower has carved out in the cracks of our system's juridical flooring to provide its abuse with limitless refuge. We might call this a secure autocracy, but I also think journalist Ted Gupp got it right when he called the post-9/11 shuttering of the US government a secretocracy, operating beyond any tolerable limit of secrecy, mostly for secrecy's own sake now. Gupp reminds us the quickest way to consolidate power and disenfranchise those who would challenge it is to deprive people of information, secrecy. You can't challenge something without good information, he says. Having said all that, I'm going to give you a very quick and dirty snapshot of a few sites that persist within this spectrum of dark infrastructure to provoke your consideration of another set of spatial implications that routinely flies under the radar of our daily urban conversation. To do this, I'm turning to the Air Force of all places, specifically to the Predator drone, or the unmanned aerial vehicle. What better way to cast light on the military's own secret landscape than through the eyes of one of its own most prized panoptic devices? If there ever were a timely artifact fallen from the skies of a future plagued by immortal combat, then the pilotless drone would be it. Quickly, drones have been used in the Air Force for years, for recon and surveillance, but more recently have been taking over key operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly targeted assassinations, and are expected in the future to facilitate new modes of aerial infrastructure through their transport and mobile networking capabilities. Yet not only was one drone's video feed spied on by an Iraqi hacker a few weeks ago using cheap software on the web, a recent report by a Washington think tank found that 32% of the more than 1,200 people killed by drones since 2004 were innocent bystanders. That's 1 in every 3. And just the other night on Charlie Rose, General Petraeus referred to these assassinated civilians as mere strategic obstacles in the way of perfecting the drone's use. So much for the efficacy and ethicality of the robotic warfare revolution. Now, here's where my narrative gets a little more funky. Scrolling across a screen somewhere in a cubicle on the Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, the drone politely relays messages to its chief operator thousands of miles away on the ground. 2130, day 547, unscheduled course correction due at 2200. Pre-correction check, rotation axis plus 3 degrees, quads jets C and D on pre-select, rotor ignition sequence beginning in 3, 0, thruster lines on standby. Clever as the drones had become, this particular model's ability to quote Disney's 1979 film The Black Hole falls on deaf ears. Not receiving any immediate response from the closeted pilot, the drone goes on to cite a piece from the New York Times on the rise of drone operator burnout. Just a friendly reminder, 57% of all 95 Predator drone operator mishaps and safety incidents reported to the Air Force over an 8-year period were consistent with situation awareness errors associated with perception of the environment, sensory isolation, chronic fatigue, and impaired domestic relationships. Don't be the next victim. Wake up, the drone chides. While the Predator announces its detour to a hectic display of blinking lights and unanswered security prompts, a pair of hands from another set of undisclosed coordinates pushes a squeaky computer mouse forwards and backwards, guiding the blip further away from the virtual mountain ranges of Afghanistan. Omniscient Eyes system is active. Transparent Earth system is now online, the drone confirms. A rich line of sight video feed suddenly snaps on screen. Following the drone's wayward course through the restricted airspaces, several eerie fossils of the War on Terror quickly pop into view with basic captions. In Afghanistan, the Salt Pit, first known black site to come into public view in 2005 as part of the CIA's network of secret prisons used for extraordinary rendition and interrogation, an abandoned brick factory built on a 10-acre site north of Kabul's business district. A list of other known countries and sites suspected of assisting in the rendition program appears: Morocco, Syria, Jordan, Thailand, Egypt, Pakistan, Romania, Poland, Lithuania, Uzbekistan, Algeria, France, Spain, Germany, UK, Kosovo, Italy, Portugal, Libya, Ireland, USA. Other rendition infrastructure, airport runways, private jetliners, foreign military installations. The drone pauses, searching for more data. Then another covert prison snaps into view, simply labeled the Black Jail, a little-known interrogation facility near Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, specifically used for high-level detainees, not to be confused with the newly built Bagram Theater internment facility. Multiple detainee testimony claims it is a common space of torture. No further details at this time. Further along the outskirts of Kabul, a special detention block is highlighted at the notorious Puli Shakri prison, synonymous for decades with torture and execution beginning in the 80s during Soviet rule. Block D, or Block 4, is a new multi-million-dollar facility constructed by the Americans, but theoretically run by the Afghanis to contain the overflow of detainees from Guantanamo and nearby Bagram, sites of regular violent upheavals and suspicious incidents related to torture. Official title, Afghan National Defense Detention Facility. Massive tunnel and cave complexes are highlighted, while scattered villages and districts, buildings, and other random objects on the landscape over hundreds of miles are tagged as friendly, hostile, and unknown, and this serves as a generic taxonomy superimposed over the rest of the world as the drone continues on. By proxy of the predator's verticality, an entire atlas of primitive secret war spaces detailed in a matter of hours. From privately operated inflatable tent cities in Raymondville, Texas, used to hold illegal immigrants from once invading the U.S.-Mexico border, to the pop-up court complex at Guantanamo Bay, Camp Justice, and the facility's most top-secret jail, Camp 7, used to house roughly 15 of the most valuable detainees at Guantanamo, its precise location still publicly unknown. The rule of law complex, outside of Baghdad, where detainees scooped up in daily raids are purportedly tried and convicted by the dozens each day through alarmingly speedy trials. Prison barges docked north of Amsterdam reveal the warehousing of intercepted asylum seekers, while a chain of islands in the South Pacific does the same for scores of Asian refugees once bound for Australia. The USS Bataan naval ship, recently spotted near Haiti, is flagged as having been a floating prison in January 2002 to interrogate suspects on their way to the island of Diego Garcia, a key logistical node in the secret operations of the War on Terror perched deep in the Indian Ocean. Lurking in the shadows of Baghdad's Abu Ghraib debacle, our intrepid drone draws attention to a lesser-known collection of American-run torture chambers that harbored in nearby Camp Nama, originally built by Saddam. Their names, the Black Room, Motel 6, and Hotel California. Camp Nama was eventually closed but relocated to a new headquarters in Balad, 45 miles north of Baghdad, to a place now known as the Logistics Support Area Anaconda, whose operations, we're told, are shielded in even greater secrecy. All of which really only scratches the tip of secrecy's obsidian iceberg. In addition to these outlying spaces of the War on Terror fought beyond the border of the quote-unquote free world, another layer comes online showing just how inbred secrecy is in the homeland's urban DNA of modern democracy. UC Regents, Berkeley campus, employer of Professor John Yu, primary legal counsel for the Department of Justice and architect of the now famous memo legalizing torture through enhanced interrogations. Up the road, a tiny room buried within San Francisco's AT&T building is illuminated where the NSA secretly squatted and wiretapped thousands of international phone calls made by the Americans abroad. This is just one room of an entire NSA portfolio of domestic spy space. Various configurations of detention space turn up everywhere throughout the U.S., in public schools, sporting event venues, abandoned warehouses, and old docks near locations of previously held caucus meetings, protests, and even events during political campaigns and G8 summits, secret closets in airports, shopping malls, ports of entry, next-gen paddy wagons, and so on. The predator then pulls up an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement document that gives the partial addresses of 186 unlisted and unmarked subfield offices scattered throughout the U.S. to detain unwanted immigrants, many located in the suburban office parks and commercial office spaces designed to confine individuals in transit with no beds or showers. These spaces are not subject to ICE detention standards. Deepest levels of secrecy have even hatched within the American prison system itself at two locations, the Federal Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, and the USP Marion in Illinois. Inside both, a special unit was established after 9/11, fearing an incubation of Muslim radicalization in American prisons. The Communications Management Unit, or CMU, is a highly secured wing completely isolated within these prisons, designed to monitor all inmate communications with each other and to the outside world, including with their lawyers. After being extracted from their original cells around the country, where they were entitled to standard prisoner rights, dozens of Arab inmates have been locked inside the CMUs, whose legal basis is said to be very skeletally defined. Here, they're indefinitely held and cannot challenge their status. It is, for all intents and purposes, a little Guantanamo within our American prison system itself. Furthermore, with our daily urban fabric becomes more and more rigged, as our daily urban fabric becomes more and more rigged for military control through superficial transformations like the CCTV camera, fortifications of public space, full-body airport scanners, and new designated free speech zones, and even by deeper transgressions in the form of increased militarization of our domestic enforcement agencies, secrecy is also rearing its head in these other very obvious ways as well. These shields against scrutiny continue to delimit the checks and balances on private power while placing harsher constraints on the potency of public agency, and in my view compose the kind of urban ruin we have to fear the most, the ruin of daily life, in the form of excessive security, inflammatory fear culture, quarantine civil action, and the wars on human rights waged through the law itself here at home. We now live in a discursive ruin that formats the landscape for the operating systems of automated political secrecy. I'm going to stop there and wait for the discussion to continue.